So, we talked about the causes of the French Revolution. Now we're going to look at uh, how the American Revolution impacted the French Revolution and their call for social equality as expressed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So, how did the American Revolution influence the French Revolution? First, let's look at how the American Revolution was the first of several revolutions going on around the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, these are called the Atlantic Revolutions. So, you get the American Revolution, right? Uh, and that has kind of a influence on the French Revolution here in France. Those ideas start to spread throughout Europe, and then there wars start, and they are distracted while the Latin American countries also begin revolutions of their own for democracy and ideas in the Enlightenment. So it's kind of chain reaction throughout the Atlantic world. So the American Revolution, um, you've probably heard before, what the reasons for the start of it was, and taxes were a big thing, right? Just like in the French Revolution, they were unhappy over the uneven way taxes were paid. Um, Colonists were unhappy with the amount of taxes, but also with uh, the lack of representation they had in the Americas, right? Because England has this thing called Parliament, which is where you can elect people to represent you in the government. But the colonists didn't really have anyone they could elect. They couldn't vote on representatives, right? And they had a lot of colonists. A lot of the colonies had their own representative governments, right? They had their own uh, bodies that represented them that you could go to. You could be elected to, and they would discuss the issues of the colonies. But the problem was those really had no official power sometimes, right? Like the British Empire ultimately had the power there. um, One big thing was tea. uh, British love their tea time and all that. The British put a tax on the tea to help raise money since they've been fighting wars in Europe and the Americas. They had to pay back those debts, and the American colonists had been getting a lot of illegal tea from uh, other countries, which they were not supposed to do. So the British were like, you can only have all these products like tea and glass and lead and paper if they have our stamp on them. So they're trying to raise money, right, to pay off some debts. Now, another thing happening before the revolution, we got the Boston Tea Party, right? That um, protest over the tax on tea and the price of tea. They throw tea into the harbor. There's also the Boston Massacre, which was another kind of event before the American Revolution that kind of is leading up to the Revolution. And when you think massacre, you might think, a huge amount of deaths and a big bloody battle kind of. But really, the Boston Massacre only resulted in 5 deaths, ultimately. Um, there's kind of like a mob forming in Boston, a group of colonists, and there's some soldiers come out to try to keep the peace, and then the mob starts throwing stuff at them like stones and snowballs, and then a soldier ultimately opens fire, and 5 people are killed. It's interesting to me that first Vice President John Adams represented some of those soldiers and got 2 of them off without as innocent, right? And so he supported the colonists and the patriots, but he also believed in a fair trial, right, for everyone. Just kind of a quick overview of the revolution. Um, so at first, there's some successes, right? The Americans are able to win a few battles like Bunker Hill and Fort Ticonderoga, but then the British launch a big invasion of the colonies. Right, the British are one of, if not the most powerful military force in the world at the time, and they probably are operating on the assumption, we can go in and kill these kill these rebellious colonists, and stop this pretty quick. Won't have a big problem. However, um, later countries like France and Spain and the Netherlands will actually help the Americans, so that'll kind of throw some problems in there. But after the quick successes at the beginning, there's a full-scale invasion, and Britain starts to take back some of the territory they had lost at the beginning, and starts to win a bunch of battles. And by 1780, the American forces are down to only 6,000 soldiers. Right, they're running out of money. Their contracts are up. Their term, the soldiers are leaving. They don't. General Washington they don't know if he doesn't know if his soldiers will be back after like the winter. The British forces are moving north towards Carolina, winning these battles as they go, doing very well at first, but they start to run into these frontier fighters using guerrilla tactics, right, like hit and run tactics, to wear down the British, right, because they know they can't usually beat the British if they fight them head on in a battle, but if they can hit them and run and just make them so discouraged that they eventually leave. That's kind of the tactic there. Just shoot them, get as many as you can, then run away before they have a chance to shoot back. That actually becomes quite effective. Now, of course, there are battles where they line up and walk towards each other and shoot and reload and walk again, and it's kind of silly if you think about it. But America doesn't always do very well in those battles. They do have some later victories at Battle of Kings Mountain and Cowpens and others. Eventually, with the help of like the French and the Spanish and money from the Netherlands, they are able to fight the British and force them to the town of Yorktown, where the Americans surround Yorktown, and the French Navy is blocking the retreat, and they are forced to surrender. And then they acknowledge the United States as a free and sovereign independent state after a few years of negotiations. You see, from 81 is when the war was pretty much over. It took almost 2 years for the Treaty of Paris to be signed. Think about how long it takes to get from America to Britain back and forth on a boat. It takes a long time. That's why it takes so long. And founding fathers go about creating a new radical form of government, first of its kind. Now, some things are radical. Now, some things were not so radical, if you think about it. So, the new government, right, was pretty radical. The idea that there wouldn't be a king. Most countries, most places in the world had a king or an emperor. Now, they were like, you can vote for the head of this government and those who are going to make the rules in this government, make the decisions. So that was pretty radical. However, those who had power remained more or less the same, right? When the United States was first created, only a relatively small group could vote. White men with property were the first group who could vote, right? Now that changes as the country goes, but at first it was only white men with property, so that was not terribly radical, and that was kind of more status quo. Here we have a scene of the founding fathers, right? Some of which, they're writing these lofty ideas about freedom and liberty and democracy, while many of them, were owning enslaved people, running forced labor camps, right, of enslaved African Americans. Some complicated men there. So how the American Revolution influenced the French Revolution, you can see it in the documents, right? The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was a document created by the French Revolution. Then you can see, we're going to look at, you can see how it was inspired by things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In fact, Thomas Jefferson helps write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So we'll see some parallels here. For instance, first thing you look at, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. That sounds to me a lot like all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, right? From the Declaration of Independence. Like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and liberty, property. That sounds just like Locke. And there's just all of the points in here. We're going to look at a few of them. You can get things like you see in the Bill of Rights, about everybody's entitled to a trial, innocent until proven guilty. Free communication of ideas and opinions, right? It sounds like freedom of speech. And then you can go through these, but there's just, you can see the parallels between some of the founding documents of the United States, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and these documents coming out of the French Revolution, like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen.